When I first registered on Tinder, I didn't have high expectations. I just wanted to have some fun and maybe meet someone interesting. However, what awaited me exceeded all my expectations, and not always in a good way. First date. My first match was a guy named Ben. His profile had pictures from his travels, and he looked quite attractive, so I decided to give it a try. We agreed to meet at a cafe, and I arrived feeling a bit nervous. Ben turned out to be charming, but as soon as the conversation turned to his hobbies, I realized something was off. He started talking about his interests, collecting model cars and playing board games. I tried to keep the conversation going, but soon I felt like I was being interrogated. At one point, he even pulled out his collection of miniature cars from his backpack and started showing them to me, ignoring my attempts to steer the conversation elsewhere. After an hour of chatting, I felt like I was at a police inquiry. When I tried to change the subject and talk about my passion for photography, he interrupted me. "Why do you need that? Better tell me how you feel about Formula One." I realized this date was definitely not for me. Eventually, I excused myself and left, promising myself never to meet guys who couldn't listen again. Second date. Next up was Alex. His profile read, "I love adventures and thrills." This sounded intriguing, so I decided to give him a chance. We agreed to meet in the park for a picnic. When I arrived, he had already set up the food on a blanket and looked quite confident. At first, everything went well. We laughed and discussed various topics. But soon the conversation took a strange turn. Alex started telling me about his extreme hobbies, skydiving and mountaineering. He became so engrossed in his stories that he began demonstrating safety techniques right on the blanket, almost flipping over. At one point, he suggested we go skydiving together on the weekend. I was in shock. It was too fast. I politely declined, but he insisted, saying it would give me adrenaline. I felt uncomfortable and decided it was better to leave. Third date. After 2 unsuccessful attempts, I decided to take a break. But soon I matched with a guy named John. His profile was filled with funny jokes and memes. He seemed very cheerful. We started chatting and quickly hit it off. John suggested we meet at a bowling alley. When I arrived, he was already waiting for me with a huge smile. We started playing, and everything was going great. He turned out to be a good player and lifted my spirits with his jokes. But soon I noticed that John started drinking a bit. At first, it was fun, but by the middle of the game, he could barely hold the ball properly and began yelling every time he won. By the end of the evening, he approached a group of people at a nearby table and started telling them about our games, adding details that had nothing to do with reality. I was in shock. He described our game as an epic battle where he was almost saving the world from villains. I tried to stop him, but he just laughed. When we went outside, John suddenly decided it was time to take selfies with strangers. He started approaching unfamiliar people and asking them to take pictures with us. I felt awkward and tried to leave, but he didn't notice my discomfort. In the end, I simply told him that I needed to go home. He tried to hug me goodbye, but instead almost fell over. I quickly exited the situation and went home with thoughts of never going on Tinder dates again. Fourth date. Despite all the misadventures, I decided to try again and met Maxim. He seemed calm and balanced with interesting hobbies, photography and cooking. We agreed to meet at a cozy restaurant. When I arrived, Max was already waiting for me at the table. He looked great and was very polite. We started talking about our favorite dishes to cook. Everything was going well until he ordered an exotic seafood dish for himself. When the food arrived, Max started telling me how he caught these seafood himself during his trips to the sea. He got so carried away that he leaned over the table too far. At that moment, the shell slipped from his hands and hit my side. Food flew everywhere. I was in shock and didn't know how to react. Max tried to apologize and clean up after himself but only made things worse with his embarrassment. In the end, they brought us new food, but the atmosphere was ruined. I felt awkward and decided to leave after the main course. Max was disappointed, but I explained that it just wasn't our day. Fifth date. After all these adventures, I almost decided to close my Tinder profile for good. But my friend convinced me to give it another shot. What if it works out? And then I met a guy named Harry. He looked quite cute and promised to be different. We agreed to meet at an art cafe. When I arrived, Harry was already waiting for me with a big bouquet of flowers. It was nice. We started discussing art and creativity. But soon the conversation became strange. Harry began talking about his spiritual practices, including crystal meditation and communicating with nature spirits. I tried to keep the conversation going, but he became more eccentric by the minute. At one point, he suggested we do a joint meditation right in the cafe. I was shocked by his suggestion. It was too strange for a first date. I politely declined and tried to switch topics to something more familiar, like movies or music. But Harry kept talking about his practices and even started showing me different meditation poses. Eventually, I realized this date wasn't for me either. I excused myself and left, feeling a bit lost after all of this. Sixth date. After all these experiences, I decided to give one last guy a chance named Ron. He seemed quite nice and promised to be normal. We agreed to meet at a bar. When I arrived, Ron was already waiting for me at a table with cocktails in hand. He turned out to be very sociable and an interesting conversationalist. We discussed many topics, from music to travel. But soon Ron became too open. He began sharing intimate stories from his past relationships as easily as if we had known each other for years. I felt awkward and tried to change the subject. When the conversation became even more explicit, he started talking about his preferences in bed. I realized this wasn't the date I was looking for. In the end, I excused myself and left the bar with thoughts that Tinder dates don't always meet expectations. Seventh date. Despite all these failures, I decided to give one last guy named John a chance. He seemed quite cute and promised to be normal. We agreed to meet at a bar. When I arrived, John was already waiting for me at a table with cocktails in hand. He turned out to be very sociable and an interesting conversationalist. We discussed many topics, from music to travel. But soon John became too open. He began sharing intimate stories from his past relationships as easily as if we had known each other for years. I felt awkward and tried to change the subject. When the conversation became even more explicit, he started talking about his preferences in bed. I realized this wasn't the date I was looking for. In the end, I excused myself and left the bar with thoughts that Tinder dates don't always meet expectations. Despite all these strange encounters and trashy moments, I learned one thing: sometimes such situations make us stronger and teach us to value real relationships. Perhaps somewhere out there is that special person who will become my perfect partner.